Welcome back to Masterclass. We had a technical difficulty. I don't know what I did wrong, but somehow something glitched out and I ran out of hard drive space while recording this. That's very unprofessional for Coursera. And I was on such a Jimmy Roger about Le Vampire, which is actually in part one of this deuced up episode now, and that we're going to go about maybe 40 more minutes or less to capture the second half of the class is only at the whims of it doesn't shut off again, mechanically errors on its own. But that I think I had the hard disk space pretty full and I should have checked it closer is my fault that it's very unuser friendly when it comes to making space on the drive is every technician's nightmare. Now we're going to one. I loved how the Vampire kind of open ended and it just kind of kicked off into outer space, and you thought I wasn't going to talk about anything else, and you thought you were out of class for today, but that we're counting by the hour and not by the minute generates these 20-minute clips that are haywire out there, especially after I get done saying I'm done doing 20-minute clips. My computer cuts out. It's a 20-minute clip. I just said I was doing hour classes, and then it's a 20-minute clip. That is why we're using technology, and it's so much fun. But that YouTube Masterclass does give us the premium deal on what our sound and audio and our transfers look like is true. And they do give us a lot of good bands to use from. And sorry there's no music in this episode. Recently I released a new CD of my own solo act, Poor White Trash, and that goes right into what I was going to say about the Civil War movies, and we're not going to spend too much time on these. But I gotta talk about two of the best movies up there with Le Vampire and I Was Born But, and that's The Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind. Now, The Birth of a Nation's important because everybody knows D.W. Griffith was trying to make a feature film like Cabaret in 1914, and to do it, he would have more stunt drivers on horses than ever before. After leaving Edison for electrocution of an elephant treating an animal bad, Griffith started Hollywood with the Humane Society. He started Hollywood by finding all the actors, assembling all the sound stages, becoming a stuntman. He's even in a movie called The Mountain Eagle. He started making movies at Tin Pan Alley like Edwin Porter, and they started making Rules of Cutting. Judith of Bethulia was the first feature film in America, and it was by Griffith. That Squaw Man was 1914, means it comes before Birth of a Nation. The Birth of a Nation is over 3 hours long, but wouldn't be if they would have cut the Klansman ending off like some say Griffith would have done if he didn't have so much influence from the Klan itself determining every movement of the film, because it was based on a play that his dad, D.W. Griffith's dad, the orator, was talking about this ideal utopia of the South where slaves are like your son. And it's interesting because D.W. Griffith made two films that weren't that racist early on, and it was called A Slave and His Trust, where because he's a slave, it's already racist. But what happens is this family, this white family lives in a cabin, and this slave lives downstairs, and the cabin catches fire, and everybody gets out, but there's like a little girl left behind. So the black slave goes in, gets the white girl out, brings her to his family, and they all invite him in to be family. And it's just so lovey-dovey. It's just so not racist by today's standards, right? And then there's the ultimate zinger. Griffith was so mad that the Klan was following him around on all the ones he wanted to do about civil rights. And Griffith really was kind of a Democrat and wanted to see black film come to a head, and was the one that funded Within Our Gates 4 years after Birth of the Nation, around the time of Broken Blossoms. And these are all movies that are unracist. Well, welcome to the proud Kentuckian, because now you got the whole Klan coming after this guy who's like Griffith, basically, in a Tin Pan Alley short where it's not even a one-reeler. And what happens is that when the guy refuses to join the Klan keeps coming back at him until the guy ends up killed by the Klan because he won't join. Now, I don't know if it was Griffith just doing a 180 or wrecking a train off a cliff like David Lean likes to do, or what he was doing. But for some reason, he went back to the Klansmen for the source on the Civil War, and of course, those history books from the moment that the movie starts until about the moment the Klan rises is completely accurate. Now, that the moment the Klan rises isn't accurate isn't totally true, because the Klan was what saved the South from total destruction. Not because the Klan were racist and were starting a race war, but because the whole pandemonium in the state of the conquered South was creating this furioso environment that only the Klan could retain. But that was such a short incident in history. And Griffith pretty much fails that point by saying that somehow the Klansmen defended the Northerners too, which being a Klansman in the North was illegal, and black people were already integrated into society in the North, and we all saw 12 Years a Slave. So, Birth of a Nation, what a Civil War epic. There's a war scene in it that's better than the war scene in War and Peace described, where the cannonball's flying and Prince Andrea rides after it. It's that long tracking shot on the battlefield. This is the War and Peace of battle sequences. And it's why I think this is kind of a disaster film. Because like Intolerance is a disaster film, and Last Days of Pompeii were these, like, and as much as they didn't want to admit it, they were doing these cinema of attractions, and that Griffith creates this world even out of his Humane Society of using 15,000 horses, and then of course Intolerance has 16,000 horses, and none of them got hurt bad. But there's another flaw with the film besides the North getting saved by the Klan, and that is that the black people in the movie are actually white people wearing blackface. And I was already discussing this with a friend who was discussing Othello with Orson Welles, and for him to come out of the John Houseman Project and still throw on blackface for Othello is kind of offensive, especially because it's like Orson Welles who likes to be provocative, but that it's not the same as Birth of a Nation blackface, when any and all demeaning stereotype will be used by the hustler guys in the fake black mask that are probably straight off of vaudeville and are about to lynch themselves because now they got to play the Klan in one shot and the blackface in the next shot. And now they're all confused, and Griffith's laughing his ass off because he's about to drive this train over a cliff. But that the assassination of Lincoln is so cinema for the sake of cinema, it recreates it just like they talk about it at the Ford Theater about how it happened. I've been to the Ford Theater where Lincoln was assassinated. I heard the story. It's exactly like what happens in Birth of a Nation. That he yells "Sic Semper Tyrannis" when he stands up and breaks his leg. He limps off the stage. Later they burn him down in a cabin in a real story, but they didn't show that part necessarily on Birth of a Nation, but they did show about everything else, that none of the racial stereotypes in this movie make sense, that somehow a mulatto's in charge of the government in the North, and that's a bad thing. If there were mulattoes in the North, which there probably were, and they did control the government, which they probably did, who's to say they didn't do a great job? I mean, since when did Obama not do a good job as a black president? I mean, what more could he have done? The whole thing was on a silver-lated grill, dude. So, like, if there were mulattoes that were in charge in the North, that was not a bad thing. Like they're showing in the movie, like he's some kind of deranged mulatto. Like, you think Griffith was pissed at Reefer Madness. I was pissed when I saw all these guys wearing blackface, making God knows what ridiculous out of themselves. And this is a lot of the movie that's dated. But there's a scene so heinous that it shows these guys in blackface in Congress, and they've got their feet up on the table, and they got chickens everywhere, and they got fried chicken, and it's terrible. I can't even believe I'm repeating this. And then of all the asinine moves of this movie, there's an N-word in it. And I know we're not talking Django Unchained, where there's inwards, so many inwards that it's the woodshed, and we never say it again. But in this one, it's a drop of the first N-word probably in film history, and it should have never been said, and it's by the blackfaces of the North, which makes me really terrified and think that Spike Lee was right, that there's house N-words and there's slave N-words, and almost everybody's a slave N-word, and the house N-words are like the guy enslaved in his trust who's with his white family to the end and is going to fight back any crime that comes against his white family so he can permanently be a slave and be whipped and bullied. And it's a good thing my Birth of a Nation Blu-ray is stuck in the box, because now I'm not going to have to get it out and play clips, because I was worried. And that I do have other versions of Birth of a Nation may not be true, because I think I gave my dad a copy. And I don't know if he joined the Klan after that, but he was doing all his white sheets in the laundry the other day. I wasn't sure what he was doing them for. No, I'm just kidding. My dad's not really a Klan that would be secret anyway if he was. So I'm not a Klansman, though. I can relate to D.W. Griffith, though. I've gotten some history lessons way wrong before, like way worse than that. Like I thought, like when Attila the Hun fought the Mongols and they were in Carthage versus Roman Empire, that all four countries obliterated each other. But that is an accurate point of view of history. But Napoleon still walked out okay, or was Waterloo right after that? Well, there's a Napoleon by Ridley Scott coming out, so we'll check it out then. But the Abel Gance Napoleon says that after winning the Battle of Toulon, he ascended into heaven and went straight to God's cradle in his arms. This is Gone with the Wind. It's Birth of a Nation 2, only it's the remake of Birth of a Nation in color, up to date, and totally still filled with heresies of multicultural heresies of unpolitical correctness, which, by the way, I must finish a point on Birth of a Nation. That Birth of a Nation is the most accomplished film to this date isn't necessarily true with Cabiria and Inferno and even the story of the Kelly Gang coming before, but that it is a technical achievement still unachievable by today's standards, like Intolerance, is true. And that the special effects and the army of horses and everything was so expensive that Griffith went into his own family estate and bankrupted himself, never making the money back, even when the clan was trying to pay him and he wouldn't take money from them. Because we all know what happened to the proud Kentuckian. But here we go. Birth of the Nation was one time shown by this artist named DJ Spooky, and he spun these lamps and like charms and these circles around the characters' heads to show how their hierarchies are enabled and disabled in the context of the frame. Now, this proves two things. It proves that there are hierarchical measures in film content and form that flash together in the use of somewhat racist terms. If you put a white guy above a black guy and he's looking down upon him, it's going to have the effect of a hierarchy. It just does. I don't like that it does, but that's not the point here. The point here is that Griffith's scope is so big and on these two North and South families and brother against brother and wars pieces and all these things that happen in the movie that are expensive and that he puts out of pocket and he goes cinema for the sake of cinema. That D.W. Griffith constantly apologized later for the racism of his film didn't let him not go to hell at the end of his life and feel like a racist. Now, the amazing thing about this movie is the meticulous attention to detail that DJ Spooky also proves that everything is simulacrum, everything is suture, which means that there's symmetry between everything. Now, symmetry is different than the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is when you're putting a camera on an object and you build a tic-tac-toe grid right across the side of the proscenium, or the picture. And when you've built it there, you can select a dot on any of the four corners of the square in the middle of the tic-tac-toe box. And that's really, if you're shooting from left to right, you should shoot from the bottom left dot, right? So, Birth of a Nation proves, by DJ Spooky saying and setting up all these hierarchies, it also proves that it has symmetry. Symmetry is where you draw a line straight down the middle, and all humans have symmetry. Movies have symmetry. That movie, Victor Victoria, I don't know how, that's based on all those Victor Victoria movies from Germany. The American one with Blake Edwards, I don't know how in Victor Victoria they have so much symmetry. Like, it's masculine and feminine on each side, but that they're mirror worlds of each other and they keep flashing back and forth. And the symmetry in Birth of a Nation, as opposed to all of Griffith's other movies, is tighter than ever. And it's because Griffith wasn't working with a script anymore. The Klan had already burned 2 copies of his script just to burn him and just to haze him as though he was going to join their club and write nothing but a Triumph of the Will Klan movie. Which is kind of what this movie ended up being, was a Triumph of the Will Klan movie. It's not really great, except for the fact that it represents the Civil War, kind of how it happened, but just the way the intertitle cards show it is really blackmailing an old system. Is really blackmailing an old system of typography, and I don't think that if the visuals would have been placed to characteristically not as racist words. I think it would have worked better. That Oscar Michaud, the first black director, liked Birth of a Nation and thought it was a multicultural film and was kind of sad that it had to be shot in blackface and was kind of sad that the Klan kills everybody and the Klan is forcing them to vote at the end and everything. But now we're to Victor Fleming. He just got off Wizard of Oz, or did you just get on Wizard of Oz? And now you got Clark Gable and Vivian Leigh. Now the Stonemans and the Camerons in Birth of a Nation, the Stonemans being the North and the Camerons being the South, having kids that have fought each other and even being in their own family and fighting on the North and South. And then to have the Klan come in with the carpetbaggers doesn't mention the sharecroppers. Now, the sharecroppers don't come into Gone with the Wind, and because of Birth of a Nation in that context of how we historicize and legendize the golden age of the South, we come to Birth of a Nation where we're still informally measuring the South, and we're measuring it as the golden god that got defeated. When Atlanta burns in Birth of a Nation, Griffith basically feels like taking out a briefcase of money and throwing it into the Atlanta fire because that's how much it's going to cost him to clean up the set. And I got to be honest with you, those sets are so huge in Birth of a Nation that Thomas Edison wouldn't have been able to handle a production like that. That Cabiria and Italy could handle a production like that. Nobody really knows how, because they must have had acrobats like Cirque du Soleil style in weird outfits all together dressed like ready for a Méliès shot where there's hundreds of them in devil outfits. I mean, how these Italian movies were made, I don't know. It's like, how did Spartacus get made? Gone with the Wind, how did this get made? It's in classical aspect. It's got Technicolor. In 1939, everybody thinks, oh, 1967, The Graduate, that's when Technicolor was always the standard until Last Picture Show, which went in black and white, right? Well, there's some other black and white movies, and Andy Warhol sometimes shot in black and white. Kenneth Anger. But Gone with the Wind's in color, and it's an early film, and that there's actual black people in it, but they do have to go through the run-of-the-mill stereotypes. And I'm sorry to say this, but I can't even repeat the name of one of the characters in this. She won an Oscar for her portrayal, but it's a racist character. But that the character does say the words to Vivian Leigh, "You are poor white trash." And that's where I got my solo act name from, was the lady in this movie that I can't say her name. She did say poor white trash. And when I heard her say it, it was the only time I've ever heard in any movie a black person stand up for themselves and call a white guy poor white trash. If it's in another movie, please point it out, because I want to see it, because that's why I love Gone with the Wind. Everything went wrong, and there's those moments of bliss. Birth of a Nation is low on moments of bliss, really. It's so much garbage that you're just like, I know this is the perfect Renaissance painting of a symmetry, but why is he using it to be proto-fascist, And I love Griffith, and Griffith's my hero, and Birth of a Nation and The Greatest Question were the ones he messed up with race. His other movies, questionable, Broken Blossoms, a little racist, but not as bad, because now there's a couple that's in love, Lillian Gish, and Lillian Gish is in Birth of a Nation, by the way. And Lillian Gish thought it was a great movie. She didn't even think it had anything to do with the Klan, and that's like Vivian Leigh in Gone with the Wind. She doesn't know that she's just feminist traveling around the disaster movie that is the Civil War, and we're following her footsteps. See, because in Birth of a Nation, we're usually following Ben Cameron of the South. He's like this renovated version of Griffith's dad, Ording the Klansman. But in Gone with the Wind, we have Clark Gable, who's like a renegade Southern captain, and he thinks we have to move fast as the South. And the South shown in all its utopia, bliss, and glory. And all the slaves are working for fun, and they're all singing in the fields, and everybody's having their song of the South, and it's great. And the South utopia is big, and we're talking. I did an album once kind of parodying this called Confederate Atheist. And just between you and me, I can kind of see what the Confederate Atheist was pointing out. But that, on the other hand, I don't respect the slave trade. It makes me sound like Ken Burns just saying slavery was the whole issue. That's why it's bad. Well, yeah, slavery is the whole issue, and that's why it was bad. That's why the abolitionists eventually moved in the sharecroppers, and they chased the carpetbaggers out. That those films, Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind, stopped before that makes no sense, because that's the North retaining control over the South, setting it up with industry, and getting it ready for capitalism. instead of living off these social pockets of how many men can we stock up and use to get our crops fed and picked and everything. And I can't believe I just said that word. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm treading thin ice here. That Obama made a very important message recently to all librarians saying that we can no longer ban books that have the N word in it. Well, I'm glad Obama said that because I was getting ready to ban Mark Twain right before Obama said that. And now I put Mark Twain back on the shelf because Obama said even though it's got N words, he wants all books on the shelf. He doesn't want anything taken off. And Gone with the Wind, same way. I was about ready to ban it, and then I saw it again. Birth of the Nation, I was about ready to ban it, and then I saw it again. And then I realized with Birth of the Nation, we should just ban all copies of it except mine. That way I have the only copy, and I can truly be the shareholder and be the only person that's seen it and be like, it could be worse than Big Mama's House. It could be Birth of the Nation. But Gone with the Wind, and the thing that makes Gone with the Wind almost worse is now they're not in blackface, so it's like more of an aesthetic. There's real black people in the film. But now they're going totally apey with their stereotypes again. And I don't understand how the stereotypes are not just a figment of history, because we've seen Le Vampire, we've seen no stereotypes at all in there, and even the Grand Guignol horror film suspense thriller types. Like Irma Vep could have been a freaking raccoon costume for all we know. And then we get to all these quotes on the back. The Hollywood Reporter, the greatest motion picture ever made. I wonder if the Hollywood Reporter still believes that. I should call the Hollywood Reporter after we're done and see if they really still think Gone with the Wind's the best movie ever made. Because that's what they have. The greatest motion picture ever made, the Hollywood Reporter said. Now we're just getting good because the back of this cover makes it look like Wizard of Oz, and I can't barely distinguish between the two when the director was going blaze blaze to both. That they're both feminist films, but Wizard of Oz is for kids, has a tornado that throws a house in the air and an X-rated skeleton of a witch that was riding on a bike to steal Dorothy's dog in the real world, that she wakes up in the real world in a black and white reality that's reality only in black and white, and Oz is in color. Gone with the Wind, all color. And we're talking everything is lavish, big production design like Birth of a Nation, plot like Birth of a Nation, though Lincoln himself and all the generals like that were in the battle, General Lee, all these generals that were in Birth of a Nation and Abraham Lincoln and all these pivotal moments in history, even when the slaves at the end of Birth of a Nation do get 40 acres and a mule. But that's treading water with Spike Lee, and I don't want to cross him. But I'm going to have to diss on myself a little bit because I still have a soft spot for total chaotic Civil War movies that don't go right. It's a train wreck aesthetic. The director, like Kubrick, planned the train wreck from the start. That you can't take your eyes off of it. That you'd rather be watching the DJ Spooky version and learning about symmetry and how hierarchies expand race, like Ways of Seeing always promoted, and this movie's like proving. And then we get to Gone with the Wind, and there's a Klansman moment with Ward Bond later in the movie that's all done secretive. That there's some black guys that still love Scarlet, but they got to go to the Underground Railroad, and it's not even spelled out how they're going to live in the South in these shanty towns. That these two live high off the purse on their families' millions of dollars estates, and that they love each other through hard times like after the war. And the only part of this movie that I thought was really troublesome other than the racism was that Clark Gable actually had the balls to diss Vivian Lee for not having soft hands anymore. Like she had to work her ass off to impress him and get to where she was, and that should have impressed him that she did have leather hands. Dude, if my chick just built a factory and got everybody on the running floor of industry and rebuilt Atlanta with her factory and her hands were a little leathery, I don't think I'd turn her away. But that Clark Gable gets so jurisprudent about being in prison and she's busting him out that he's kind of a misogynist bastard by saying that her hands aren't soft anymore. But it's the little things that kill, and overall it's a great movie. I don't think that really I had too much trouble with it because the soundtrack matches the images. The black stereotypes aren't as bad as Birth of a Nation, except the character, I can't say which name it is. That I mentioned Song of the South as being another version of these Southern Civil War utopias that just aren't going to look well for the African American. And that makes sense because the Union, which was the Republic, which was Abraham Lincoln, was the one that had African Americans already adapted into their society. And all these movies in Hollywood history up to Santa Fe Trail, I think, are picking the South as their best bet for what we need to focus on during the Civil War. And to this day, I can't really think of a movie that talks about how heroic the North was in destroying the South and then regaining them as states to come back to the Union. We always pick the South as the one because they're the ones that get Atlanta burned down, and everybody's got to make a movie where Atlanta burns down. That Clark Gable does kind of repeat his misogyny, but makes up for it all in the end when he says, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn, is weird because we're all cheering on that he says that, even though she just basically told him she was suicidal and gonna blow up her whole ranch with her on it. And he's like, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. Like, what he says is worse than what she says. And we're all cheering because he's got this badass attitude. I confess, I was cheering because he has this badass attitude. I was cheering when he said, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn, because it kind of put her in her place and made her realize she was still whining about the things that could be replaced. Now, the only thing that could have saved Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind a lot of legwork and trouble is after all the cannons flying, after all the bodies are everywhere, and after these big, long, sweeping, mural shots that are like in Birth of a Nation and Intolerance, and you're going over these dead bodies everywhere, and there's Sloan, and if they would have had, then the carpetbaggers come in, and there's more racism because the carpetbaggers got some black friends supposedly from the North, but they're really from the South, and he captured them from the Underground Railroad or whatever. But that they're selling back the wasteland of the South to the people in the South did actually happen, but not long after. The sharecroppers, the same guys that were growing hemp, like George Washington was in his garden, are coming down to bag the carpetbaggers, to tell the Klan to fuck off and to save their black friends and bring them to the North. And that these movies totally ignore that proves that we can only see the side of the Civil War from the South because they lost. And because we like the underdog, sure, but why can't we just admit the South lost the war? And the sharecroppers were the ones that took back the South, gave it back to the South, gave them enough money to build industry, and took the fucking black people to the North where they wouldn't be abused anymore. But that Oscar Micheaux saw Birth of a Nation. I don't know if he saw Gone with the Wind. I don't know what the history is after he did that Paul Robeson Body and Soul. And that's a good movie too, but why the preacher is always a bad guy in Oscar Micheaux's movies, I'll never understand. Because these African Americans that are in these churches are about to kill the preacher for him being absurd, and yet the preacher absurds it up. And there's something about preacher stereotypes that bother me almost just as bad, but that Micheaux is a far superior filmmaker. Is obvious that he can capture a modern moment better, overshadows any complaint I might have had in the first place. So we're passing through the Civil War because we've said enough. I'm just going to mention Ozu's Passing Fancy from the previous video. This is Passing Fancy, a humorous and heartfelt study of a close, if fraught, father-son relationship. It's more of the kids' movies by Ozu, that they're family comedies. And I just got to mention, Ozu does domestic melodramas really well. And he usually does domestic melodramas based on the system of mono no aware, which is revealing the sadness in a scene. And that these movies, like I Was Born, but are about kids and their comedies, don't always reflect mono no aware, which is like where you could see just a piece of weed standing up and you'd be like, it's so sad because it bent over from the wind and it won't stand back up. And so now you're like, this weed is dying, but you can't fix it. And that means this a part of life that grew on its own without your maneuvering died. So suddenly your Zen garden's telling you that nothing is absolute, everything dies. And that is depressing. And at the heart of death is mono no aware, and that's that everything passes on. and that the domestic melodrama of the zoo are assembled like those master of the house cubes, except when they're outdoors, or looking at a clock, or looking at a train, in a few impressions of the thing. But that in Tokyo Story, which we will get to in the Japanese film section. The grandma dies on a long walk, and then everybody goes into Mononoke, and it becomes so spiritual that only Buddha himself could have buried the grandma in that movie. And I'm telling you, if Buddha doesn't come through that film and go back to the goddess, he's going to give me another bruise on my arm. And that's no laughing matter, actually. I've seen movies that one time I was watching Disney's remake of The Jungle Book, and I swear I had like a tiger bite on my arm when I came out of the theater, bro. Like somebody mauled my arm with a vampire tooth. Maybe it was Irma Vep in the middle of the Jungle Book. But I thought, well, if this film's coming to life like most Disney films do, then I'm getting out of here before Shere Khan brings the fire through the theater. This is Jules and Jim. We need to talk about these movies before we go. And I got time with y'all. We got a little bit of time, so we're going to talk about two more movies. One that we've already kind of talked about. And this is Jules and Jim. Francois Truffaut, 1959, 400 Blows. Then he did the 1960, 1961, Shoot the Piano Player. And now we're in 1962, which is right before the year Godard made Contempt. And we have the best film of the French New Wave, one of my top 10 favorite movies, Jules and Jim. And you notice how in English, that makes it sound like it's jewelry and gems, as though they're precious metals and stones. But that their name in French really is Jules and Jim, and then it's about a love triangle eventually because they fall in love with a girl, not unlike the sequence in Grand Illusion where our heroes, John Gabin and his friend, escape to Sweden or Switzerland, and like in Barry Lyndon, they meet a Swiss girl, and she takes them both in, and they have this crazy love triangle where they're both getting together with her, and she's trading back and forth between the men, and she's really trying to beat both of their girlfriend, and it's this total threesome about to happen, but the guys can't admit they're gay yet because it's still like only been mentioned in Russian cinema that people can be gay so far in the movies, which is another oversight of early cinema. And this is why I understand why people can struggle with early cinema, because there are these dated codes that weren't necessarily set to be dated just because they were from another time. But that the French movies don't have any stereotypes redundantly is a tribute to going back to the Fouillard camp of focusing on the real and how we can use reality to rearrange it to tell a story about how a severed head becomes the chase down of Irma Vep of a lifetime. Now, Jules and Jim is the one where they're doing this 400 Blows thing, only now they're all young adults. And there's Jules and there's Jim. And at the beginning, they're like these silent film characters. They're boxing each other. They go to fencing class together. They do everything together. They find the same chick. It's Jeanne Moreau. Jeanne Moreau, we all know, is beautiful from all her films. That I sometimes get her confused with Anna Karina's, only because Godard used Jeanne Moreau, I'm sure, in a film. And that Truffaut was really acting off the impulses of Breathless, 400 Blows in Hiroshima on a more when he did Shoot the Piano Player, which Shoot the Piano Player is a masterpiece. I mean, I've got the video around here somewhere too. The video is hard to find. And really, the soundtrack by Charles Aznavour is almost as good as the soundtrack to Elevator to the Gallows, that I think was Charlie Parker. But Jules and Jim has an excellent score. There's this scene in Jules and Jim where John Moreau writes the two dudes who are in the cabin a letter, and you see her face in full close-up float and dissolve in front of this like giant river, and the camera's going back, and a crane shot looks like a drone's flying it. And as it backs up from a house, she's still in the foreground, faded in on this dissolve, saying goodbye and I love you and come back my lovers and I'll be back my lovers and I'm sorry I had to leave. And she's saying all this in the poetry while the music's going on, and the two guys are just sitting there going, I wonder if we'll ever get our lady back, because at one time, like in Grand Illusion, only that was at the end of the movie, during this movie, they're sharing the girl and they don't mind. They're like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid is like, we're such good friends, we have the same girlfriend, right? But that it's a love triangle and that the men don't fall in love is questionable because the men were already totally in love, totally homosexual. Homosexual, maybe not, but they were sleeping with the same girl and fond of each other still, even though there was a slight amount of jealousy. But I really didn't get jealousy out of Jules and Jim. It'd be like saying Band of Outsiders by Godard already has jealousy, and it doesn't. It's just like one guy misses an opportunity, another guy catches it. They're not mad at each other. They're just, it's the circus of life. And Jules and Jim has these fascinating handheld camera moves, like where they're chasing John Moreau across this bridge, and she's kind of dressed up like Charlie, a chaplain or a mime or something. And they're all running with these cameras, and it reminds me of 400 of Blows, the way they use the handheld camera. And I haven't seen a handheld camera used so good in Jules and Jim since The Last Laugh by Murnau, where they do that handheld camera that gets stuck to the string and goes bouncing off the German Expressionist set. They're like doing acrobats to get the shot. This one here we talked about a little bit, how La Jetée, and I'm not going to go into Sans Soleil, but I just want to finish up on La Jetée, that John Wagner, my mentor at Calarts, who I'm forever an underling of, has done a file on this that's somewhere on the internet, and you can find it if you search hard. And it's a maze he created of the images of La Jetée, which is already a maze of images and is already interactive. And if you rewind it, it's like playing the game backwards, and watching it's like playing a game, and that you're selecting movements from one little nuance to another in the next frame is only one way the film redirects your attention, and it's a different film every time. It just seems that way because the narration on several copies that you've probably seen along the way are different, that the Criterion version comes with Sans Soleil, which I find to be a good documentary too, Sunless, about Japanese horror films and riding around on buses and stuff. But La Jetée is the story of 12 monkeys where they're in the future. They're all wearing virtual reality masks and like these weird global eye things. They're all underground. The above world's been blown up. The guy that's a test patient, they're sending him back in time to find out how the world ended. So he goes back in time and sees himself as a kid, but his kid self sees him get killed a little later when he crosses himself as a kid for reals in the time he went back for. But that he keeps going back and collecting evidence and coming back and forth, and they're re-showing how he regains consciousness in the real world, which is the underground matrix of where they're all strapped to these tables and having these hallucinations like they're traveling in time. But that we know early on in this film that he's going to get killed in front of himself as a little kid, which is totally going to make him disappear from the whole sonographia, and he'll never redeem the fact that he almost had the reason the world got blown up, which in 12 Monkeys, there's a number of reasons the world gets blown up. It's one of your post-apocalyptic New York's ending tonight on New Year's movies, like Strange Days by Catherine Bigelow. That's the one where everything's ending on 1999 and all these virtual reality cameras go wrong and everybody's trying to solve the crime, and then the rapper gets killed and you can't solve the crime and somebody time travels even. I mean, Strange Days is an amazing anarchy of a wreck of a movie that I love. It's maybe one of the best movies directed by a female, other than some of Chantal Ackerman's movies and stuff. So, I like La Jetée a lot. I can see why John Wagner did a structuralist shot-by-shot analysis of it. It inspired me to do a shot-by-shot analysis of Birth of a Nation, which were really hard. It took me 8 years, and it's a 700-page book on Griffith and all his films, and it's a BFI book that the chairholder of USC could put out. That every 5 minutes you're going to be reading scathing versions of me scathing Griffith for being such a racist on purpose, but then turning it around and saying that he invented codified language of institutional mode of representation that became the standard mode of representation, that all shot, reverse shot, 180 line match on action, match on eye line, meet, match on shape, all comes from Birth of a Nation in a seamless way that's so put together smoothly that you can't notice the style that's creating it. And if you do pay attention to it, then it just teaches you how to make a movie. It's particularly a movie like this, which is like a Star Wars, everything's blown up, and we don't know which side to choose. So, before I go, I'm going to make a comment about why John Wagner's version of the Logette structuralist frame by frame works better. First of all, it's a shorter movie, so you can fit it into a 200-page book. Secondly, his is interactive, so you can go between the pictures and actually try to solve it so you don't see yourself die and you don't get wiped out and you do actually save the underworld. And then you as a kid gets to grow up in a free world because you somehow went back in time and fixed it by choosing the pictures in a different order. That Chris Marker, who made the film, again, like a new wave film, is not, in fact, selecting the pictures in any order you want to take them, or he would have had some kind of button on the remote control switching a chapter each time he wanted us to see the victory picture that's going to get us through this maze. That Marker puts all the photos in the total hazards way of trying to get through this movie with threshold guardians, this like folklore mythology of these things that are getting in the way. There are machines we're hooked to that we can't revive from. They have to revive us in kind of this Le Mans way to get us back into the underworld. It's so depressing that we'd rather stay in the past, or we'd rather almost get shot in front of our young self in the past. That there's some kind of an Oedipus complex going on between the kid seeing his father die at a crossroads on the pier, which La Jetée means the pier. And there's something about him seeing his mom as an adult that makes him stop before he gets shot. And that's him as a kid. Makes me think he might have been attractive, but only in a mom way of her, mainly because of how he was treating him as a young kid, which is her inner child. That could be a little bit of a too much psychological read-in. Honestly, I wouldn't want to be in those underground worlds. That's what I didn't like about The Matrix, and we'll talk more about The Matrix later. But how is it possible that the Matrix world that they're actually living in sucks so much more than the world that they're trying to destroy? And the world they're going to repopulate and have these utopias in are already as ransacked wasteland as the Gone with the Wind chariot racers that blew up on the plantation next door version of the South. That makes no sense, because as we're glorifying the South, we're showing everybody in their wreckage. And you know what? Quite frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.